Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me today for our interview. So I'm going to read out the list of questions. The first is, what do you think are the alternative constraints or possibilities for disabled people in cyberspace? Actually, it would be good also if you could just each introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm cjds.uwaterloo.ca. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the m.i.a lab.
I'm a PhD student in the m.i.a at Concordia.
And I'm Kim Sotchuk, and I'm a professor in the Department of Communication Studies and the co-director of the Mobile Media Lab, and we're all members of the m.i.a collective.
Great. Okay, so can we talk about question number 1?
Sure. Leslie, did you want to start?
Do we read out the question first, or should we just answer it?
I just answer it. I just read it out, so you could just answer. Yeah.
We were just talking that, between the cyberspace, the experience of the cyberspace is generally calling for the question of what actually do we mean by disability and which categories of impairment are we talking about, since disability is not this kind of big overarching category that we can give generic answers about, and more like it calls into question, is it a sensory impairment, what kind of a sensory impairment it is, visual, hearing impaired, or are we talking about a physical impairment? So it kind of calls into question of what actually we mean about the nature of disability and how it connects to cyberspace. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, but I think it's for us an important point that we think about disability not as just a uniform category or disabled people as one type of person, but as it compromises many types of people as well as different types of disability. What else did you want to add?
Oh, that's good.
Okay. So when thinking then about the question, the alternative constraints or possibilities for disabled people in cyberspace, this present work is about the question to a large extent of visible and invisible disabilities connected to physical impairments, not so much cognitive impairments. So in that sense, there's ways that cyberspace, allows for forms of virtual movement beyond what the borders are sometimes of the physical world, and makes possible access to certain forms of information, culture, or knowledge that may be difficult to access if physical movement is difficult.
Great. Okay, should I go on to the next question? Are you ready for the next question? Yep. Okay, so the second question is, how are barriers or possibilities in physical space then different to that of cyberspace for disabled people, in your opinions?
Well, I would say that physical space and cyberspace, they don't share the same history. So, for example, here in Montreal, you have a long history of oppression and exclusion in the physical space, which has a great influence on disabled people's daily life experiences. So we think that cyberspace has a whole different history and is now intertwined with physical space. But I would say that it's like the biggest difference between both right now with the people we are working with are really related to like their experience and where the oppression is coming from. And so I would say that in general, maybe people like lost a bit like the hope of changing things in like just, by regular means. Whereas when we use, new methods of doing advocacy and art, people maybe have more like faith in it. It creates new possibilities.
Great.
Leslie, do you want to add to that?
If you have something to say, okay. I was just thinking about like what kind of, although it's also important to think about the fluidity between cyberspace and the actual physical space, as Kim was saying before we just started the conversation. Maybe one thing in relation to our work, especially to Lawrence's piece, could be to think about how cyberspace can capture the very minute details in everyday life, and that actually do not really strike you as you are captured, as you are caught in the fluidity of action, that you don't pay attention to little details. But in kind of recorded medium and using the digital media, you can just pinpoint these details that disabled people have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and they have to manage their everyday lives according to that. For instance, in the architectural ableism pieces and in the crippling landscape, it's like how all the roles can be cluttered and what kind of effect it does on the wheelchair user, and then how you have to wait for the bus for long hours, and what kind of networks you're entangled into, like the bus network, other infrastructural things that normally you never question in everyday life, that you can bring these details one after the other in the medium of cyberspace in more detail, I think.
Great.
So again, I think, we talk about cyberspace, we think about it as well, not just as a kind of room, but it's a kind of an assemblage of devices, it's an assemblage of people, it's an assemblage of know-how and practices, and it's different kinds of media and media formats. And so our question is, how can we use all of those different elements to be able to help people notice things that they take for granted, but that act as access and barriers to the full participation of disabled people in culture, in civic life, in politics, in education, you name it, because it's so strongly embedded in the built world that we live in that here we don't even notice. And so for us, it's this question of how can cyberspace be used as itself a kind of vehicle, I suppose, to make people notice, and for us, I think, to document and to ourselves pay attention to those things.
Great. So tell me more now about your new work, so the virtual poster series, and how this project for you is linked to a CRIP intervention in cyberspace.
Alice, do you want to start?
Not necessarily. Tough question about me.
Let's think. Well, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the idea of CRIP intervention.
Yeah.
Because I think that's closely related to your piece on cripping the landscape.
Okay, yeah.
So I think it's really to change the way we see disability in general, like how, the mainstream discourse would say that disabled people are, disabled, or like impair, like their actions and their abilities are limited, and so the idea of cripping everything, cripping intervention is to make disabled the system, is to show that it's this, the system that is disabled, and it's to take action to make it not working anymore, because it seems to be working, but in fact we want to show that it's not working.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I think the work that Laurence is doing is twisting the idea in a sense of what is it that's disabled? It's not the individual, it's the way that the system is constructed. And I guess CRIP theory is related to, in ways, queer theory and other forms of theoretical intervention that use hyperbole and irony and other visual rhetorical means to basically point out this kind of problem and injustice that's not just rooted in the bodies of individuals, but really, especially in the work that Laurence did, is rooted in the landscape.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that the way we do it, we don't also negate people's sensory experience of the world. We acknowledge that people have different bodies and experience too. Was in the mainstream disability rights discourse, this question of like body differences is just, erased most of the time, and I think we think it's problematic.
Yes, we do.
Yes, I mean, one thing to add to that would be, it's a very good point that, bodies are really different, and you have to appreciate the differences rather than just taking it for granted that it's a one universal body, which is already a very well-known discourse. But in cyberspace, what might allow us and other artists and practitioners to do is to put layers on the work that might help connect different kinds of impairments and disabilities, like putting audio captions on a film, which should have already been on all other kinds of medium that are not accessible for deaf people, putting audio descriptions and making other kinds of disabilities have conversations with each other, and like, as I said, putting layers to different kinds of bodily experiences is a good possibility in cyberspace.
I also want to add to the way that CRIP intervention is done using the technology, and again I want to refer back to Laurent's piece, the Cripping the Landscape, because the wheelchair and the hero cam become not just accessories, they're integral to the work. So she's not holding it on, she's manipulating her chair, but she's the one who's made the decision where it goes from. So there's also
like a prosthesis.
Yeah, it's the camera becomes a kind of prosthesis to give you the sensation not only of the body, but of the body in relation to the technology, in relationship to the road, in relationship to all the points of possibility of movement, impossibility of movement within specific kinds of conditions. So I think there's a CRIP intervention as well of the appropriation of the technologies, where the wheelchair perspective, in this case, I think, is in some ways almost foreground, putting the viewer in a different point of view or perspective.
Right.
So the virtual poster series is partially about capturing that, but also then thinking about, what is a poster in this realm of the digital and in the realm of cyberspace? Like, where's the wall? There isn't a wall. You distribute it differently, and so we were also thinking about how to, in some ways, manipulate, maybe not CRIP, but intervene in the way we think of the relationship between 2D and 3D image, about the way that 2D image is also something that has movability because of the possibility of GIFs, but also because of its ability of a poster to circulate differently in cyberspace. So it's that kind of mutable function. So again, this work comes out of an assemblage of sort of old work, but then because of you, we created new work, and because of the challenge you posed to us. So it's also, in some ways, cyberspace is a place where the digital allows for the kind of parsing out of pieces and components and their reassemblage by us, together, separately, apart, in combination, in collaboration with each other, in collaboration with associations like RAPLIC, who are working on disability rights in Quebec, with artists like m.i.a, who's working in Barcelona with different communities, and with individual makers like Laurence or Arsley.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Could you talk a little bit about then, I didn't include this on this question list, but just the interface that people will come, when they first come to the website, they'll have the concept of the traffic lights. So the red, yellow, green. So could you talk a little bit about what that is and how you want people to navigate through that space?
Well, I remember when we decided that, I think after a while, well, I think it's all about movement for sure, and it took us a long time to decide which project should be and which color, but yeah, well, I guess, did you find like a new impression of each color?
I think we decided that, yellow was already working with Megaphone, that red, because we had used the text Stop Ableism, that red seemed appropriate for that, and then green because that was a good color for what you were doing, and it was left.
And there was also a lot of green in my video.
Yeah, it's also about let's go.
Yeah.
So the traffic lights are also about a device that's another technology that controls the movement and flow of people, cars, machines, bicycles, all kinds of people who interact in public space. So we were thinking about, well, who stops, who starts, who yields. And in some ways, Arsley was away at this point, and Laurence and I were together at a conference, and we just spent a lot of time thinking visually and metaphorically about how we could include projects we thought were related, but find a way to combine them in a way that had a separate but integrated meaning. And again, the square became important to us because of, well, the square in the grid, but also the square in the Pavé Rouge movement, the way it's been appropriated by different protest movements here, was important to us. And yeah.
Great. I think it's very successful. I really like it a lot. Thank you.
We were pretty pleased with it because it felt like we were trying to come up with something quite quickly, and we did respect the challenge you posed to us about making something new and different, but we weren't sure how we were going to do it or what it was going to be. But again, we kind of work with, I think sometimes that 3 heads are better than 1.
Right.
And we don't know what's going to get made when we sit down and chat with each other.
Yeah. No, I think it's really successful. So you've done really, really well. I'm really happy with the outcome. That's great. Okay, so let's move on to the 4th question on the list. So what is the relationship between, for you guys, what do you think is the relationship between the physical and virtual platforms in your work? Is it the same? Like, does it function the same or is it different? And how do you connect, like, the physical and the virtual space then in the work?
You want to give some examples? Well, I can comment on what I felt like while watching the pieces. And I'm just thinking that the experience that it could be kind of a repetition of what I said before, but the multi-sensorial experience in daily life that can be worked on in detail in the virtual space, like when the hero cam is put on a wheelchair and we can see the point of the wheelchair user and how it feels actually to move in a wheelchair throughout a day, that you can constantly hear in the background the sound of the wheel that makes onto the pavement, so this cluttering sound. And actually, Laurence has to live with that every day. I mean, whenever she goes out and going all around the space, and the vibration of the stones and the strong pavement, this sensory experience, this very kind of aesthetic experience that, you know, is not necessarily registered in the physical space, can be very brought up in the light in the virtual space. So this kind of connection between the physical and the actual. Also in the architectural labelism pieces, I think one important thing to say could be that these are videos done to kind of question the everyday and question the structure and kind of bring a change, a social change, so that, you know, some new policies, some new kind of architectural design could be made. So not to just do something just to question the structure of the architecture, but also to make a change in that architecture, to bring the experience of the disabled person in life, so that can be taken into account later by other people who are responsible for taking care of these spaces.
Yes, well, I think it's also changing people's own experiences. Like, for example, in my video, like, I lived that experience, I was there, but when I did it changed the way I felt. How, you know, like, my point of view from my own eyes is not the same as the one that the video can either. And you're constantly like pushed to think in like more mainstream way, that you come to forget your own experiences in some ways. I don't know if it's clear what I say, but so when you take the time to sit down and work on those things, I think it empowers you a lot. It changes the way you experience those things, and you decide to just yeah, I think that all the people that are involved in the project is just that we decide to use to tell stories that we were not able to tell before. But maybe it's the answer to another question.
Yeah, and I also want to say that because Laurence is also the president of RAPLIC, I think as well that, you know, a lot of the video material can act as supplement for making the point to people who are in a lot of ableist denial. I think the density of the problem, which I think the megaphone map shows, is like the prevalence of what we just don't notice because of the, as Laurence would say, the hegemony of stairs. And then in the architectural ableism video, those were decisions made by the participants who said, you know, we don't want to just map locations, we want to tell stories about what it means to move through that physical environment. And so again, digital tools for both recording, capturing, editing, and distributing then become ways of creating a record of that in the spaces that were chosen and scripted by the participants themselves. So it becomes a communal form of knowledge sharing and practice that then we appreciate venues where they can also be shown either as a single video or all together as a group or in different ways and be and connect to whatever issues need to be connected. And then what was have we? I think we've sort of answered everything here. But so those things are connected, and it's the same way that organizations like RAPLIC are really successfully using, you know, the media and mainstream media in some cases to try and cover events. You know, cyberspace also means that as activist organizations that they can, you know, put up the links in the post to the news coverage they have. So again, you know, cyberspace is this kind of tentacle of possibilities that we have to, they're virtual, but it's up to us to figure out creative ways that bring people together to actualize what their potential is.
Right. That's great. Question number 5, I feel like you may have already answered that, but I'll ask it anyway, and then if there's anything you want to add to it, you can. So 5 is, what are some of the outcomes of your online presence through the virtual poster series? So what do you hope to achieve in terms of disability politics through this work?
Well, many things. I think that one of the biggest challenges that we have in Montreal is just to bring a discussion about ableism, which is very central to our collective. It's like, it's the concept that it's not really part of the discourse. Well, it's not part of mainstream discourse at all, for sure. And even in the community, it's not a term that people would use. So it's really a challenge for us to bring that question into our work. But in some way, it's also easy to, you know, people know that they experience discrimination, but to talk about it and to have like the support of people that you know are interested and understand what they are going through, it's changing everything. So our hope, well, it's really to create like a space for people to come together and to challenge all the oppression that people experience.
Yeah, that otherwise doesn't get noticed or talked about. So I think that what we'd like to achieve is that we really like for the provincial and federal government and municipal government to actually respect the Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedoms just from the beginning, which is supposed to guarantee equal access to people in terms of public space. And this goes to everything. RAPLIC's most recent intervention was about polling stations that are not accessible. And so how can you participate as a citizen in democracy at even this more formal level when you create stations that are located in buildings that have 20 or 10 or 5 steps? So again, I think that we're in for the long battle, I think all of us, and I think we sort of would like very much for, we don't think the law can take care of everything, but it would be really great if there was a consciousness, at least in Montreal and in Quebec, that there's a serious issue here and transportation has to change, access to buildings has to change, and that actually there's a law in the book, but what governments choose to enforce and what they choose to ignore is really interesting and really telling and really is all about the ableism that's totally and thoroughly inscribed in our culture that people like myself are participants in and have benefited from without even knowing.
Right.
Also in the special context of Quebec, I think it's really, really important that this is a place where there are lots of immigrants, there's a big migration, there's an issue of, race, disability, and gender, and Montreal has a big gay community. So it's like disability in this specific case is kind of also pressing between the identities here and becomes a very rich subject to work upon. And unfortunately, there is not a very strong critical disability studies institution in the province of Quebec, as far as I know. And also the value of this work could be the series of persons, could be to kind of establish kind of a disciplinary discourse as well for critical disability studies. And also the work and the m.i.a collective has a kind of archival and documentary value. So for future research, people can refer to the pieces, especially in Megaphone, all the pictures and photos. There's a large database of how the architecture of Montreal is and it will be changing. So it has kind of a documentary value as well.
Yeah, it's really about creating knowledge.
And creating knowledge that then circulates, which is why the cyberspace element is, I think, crucial.
Right.
Because it means we don't know where it will go and who will look at it and what they'll respond to, and that's kind of the beauty of it.
Mm-hmm. All right. So question 6 and 7. So, and if we could try and wrap up the interview in the next 5 minutes, that would be really good. So, I was just wondering how each of you might feel that your own ideas of access and mobility have evolved or have changed through your work with the virtual poster series and then Cripping the Landscape and Megaphone, all the various projects that you've been working on. If you could each sort of talk briefly about that, or maybe it hasn't really changed, or what have been the effects of the process for you?
Well, for sure, in terms of access, we have still a long way to go. I think we know what are the challenges. When, for example, the piece that I've done, I'm totally conscious that it's not, fully accessible. Well, for me, access is a very personal thing, I guess. But when I meet new people, it's like always evolving and changing at the same time too. And even mobility, it's much more broader than what I'm, in my everyday life I thought it was. And it's just opening new opportunities to think about it in another way. I think it's more liberating in that way too.
I think having to do this and work with your deadline forced us into realizing that we were a collective and that we've been struggling with making a presence for ourselves, even though we've been working together for quite a while now. And so I think that having the exhibition and participating, and once we started talking about this idea, I think we had about 20 around the table at a certain point, and then it became, well, what can we actually realize within the timeline? So I think what it's done is it's helped us to understand the intervention that we want to make, but also how to connect it to, other art movements, other community art movements, other political art movements, and just keep doing the research within all these different realms so that our ongoing identity and collaborations can keep evolving in ways that we don't know where it's going to take us. But we're happy with kind of being forced into thinking about, well, what does it mean to have this very ambitious both political and project that uses, sort of the power of creativity and storytelling and the visual to be able to make what we see as really vital, important points about issues of access and mobility for a large number of people who, even if they're not now suffering from an impairment, or maybe who are not disabled, or they're in relationship to that environment, and they're in relationship to others, and we're part of a social network and whole that I think we all have to take accountability for and be responsible for. Your turn.
Well, I don't have much to add to that. It's all good, all well put.
So let's move to the last question then. So what do you predict are the future directions for this intersection of disability and the virtual? Like what do you think are the exciting possibilities or the challenges? Especially, as it applies to your own work as a collective.
I just see many opportunities. I guess I cannot really mention what it's doing because it's like so new but so rich at the same time. It's hard to answer that question.
I think what's interesting is that I think the work has brought us into contact with others. Like when we went to London recently, Laurel set up some meetings with other disabilities activists, and then we learned about other projects that had been done. We learned about the use of social media by groups who are doing very performative direct actions to counter cuts that are happening in Britain and new administrative regimes being put in place to cut off people's benefits. So I think you're going to see the intersection between disability rights groups using performative and artistic means to get their messages across because they're unhappy from what we heard with mainstream media. So I think you're going to see more of that online. I think we talked to people who were talking about the use of Twitter to let people know if there were demonstrations and social media. I know that there's research and work going on places like Second Life where people get together to discuss protests. So these are all ways that I think the evolution of cyberspace is being appropriated by people, disabled people, for whatever purpose and at whatever moment they need it to be to do. So I see them as it not being just an intersection, but I think disability issues can actually change the nature of what cyberspace is and who and what it includes.
Yeah.
Yeah, in that respect, it's like to add to what Kim and Laurent has been saying, that people really create their new affordances almost in the cyberspace, like disabled people in everyday life kind of always have to deal with things that are barriers, obstacles, but kind of in cyberspace, like by networking with other communities, activists, and using things like Twitter, all kinds of opportunities and prosthetic tools that cyberspace gives, they kind of create new affordances of dealing with obstacles, and sometimes even more effective ways than the actual space. We don't know, or maybe less effective. That's another question, but it's one of the good opportunities in the future, I guess.
One of the things I'd say, because of both Laurence and Arsley have mentioned intersectionality, is that what that affordance also implies is people having the economic means to be able to afford access to the networks and the tools and the technology. So again, we can't talk about this without thinking about the relationship, I think, between personal economies and lives and that whole political economy. And the more that, for example, people are forced to assume really unjust policies around healthcare or housing, the irony might be that the access that they need to the tools for new means of communication and to networks might be harder to get because of sheer economics.
Yeah.
Okay, that's actually an issue that we have right now. It's not like, for example, a megaphone project. It's not that easy to recruit participants because not a lot of disabled people can afford to have a smartphone.
Yeah.
And we have trouble getting money for projects to pay for technologies and network services, and they're really incredibly expensive. So that if you're putting a project together like that, you have to fundraise to ensure that you can subsidize participants, and so it's a challenge.
Yeah. Okay, great. I also now just wanted to throw in quickly, like it seems to me that I have posed a challenge to you in terms of deadline and asking you to sort of think more about the conceptual apparatus of the project. So I was wondering how that process has been for you and what if you've enjoyed the various challenges that I've posed to you, including now this new audio description element. That is a new project that I've added in for everybody to think more about access and how your work is going to be accessible in various layers. I think Asali was just talking about that earlier. So I do want to know how that process has been for you.
Well, we are definitely.
Yes, we are working on it. We will get it ready by the deadline.
Yeah, but I mean everything also, like the rest of the process, like the entire thesis of the exhibition. And
Well, it has been like a marathon of thinking, and yeah. Well, it has been really fun too.
It's been intense, but fun and stressful. But we thank you. I mean, again, it's like, I think we all are always working to deadline. Mm-hmm. So I think the exhibition's important, and I think once it's all over, we'll maybe have more feedback. For the moment, though, I think it's really great trying to add these other dimensions and layers to it, have something that's in a gallery space and online, working with the journal, working in this kind of very fluid, very multi-dimensional way. I think it's a really good way. I think it's a good curatorial project.
Right. So, and you've had some exposure to the other artists in the project too?
I couldn't get it.
Did we have exposure to the other artists?
Well, we looked for them on YouTube. I forgot the name of the woman. She's in the UK, I think.
Yes, Patrick. Yeah.
Watched her videos.
Watched a lot of them together, and that was great. So we really enjoyed that, and I didn't know Sarah's work, and so then again, the amazing thing about cyberspace is you give us one person and a link, and suddenly we're following like hundreds of links and finding other people and getting other ideas, and so I think it can all that kind of surfing from your computer screen or cell phone can be both. Sometimes you think I'm just wasting time here. Here I go surfing again. But on the other hand, it's a way of learning about new allies and about different kinds of projects that are exciting. So yeah, we again, I appreciate the challenge, and I'm kind of used to it. It's just September's a hard time of year.
Right, I know.
Well, it's very refreshing too, because most of the time some projects are like very mainstream. Like, if you just thought about visibility, then it's like already like something.
It's good.
But for this exhibition, you really pushed us to really think and go beyond what is generally accepted as being so amazing. Because you just, we finally thought about disabled people, that's so great.
Yeah,
you don't get anywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Stop.
Okay, I see. So you're saying there's been more of a critical push for this in this exhibition. So that's good. That's what I was hoping, yeah. And also with the audio description layer, like I think that is also a very intentional, conceptual push coming from me to get the artists to think beyond, the way that they might usually frame and create a work. So, and even though I realize that perhaps I can work with artists differently on this project in future projects, because the audio description is very time consuming and it's very difficult actually. I think it's a skill that has to be developed over time. And so that is something that I need to also think more about and how to collaborate with artists on that aspect of making work. But in any case, I'm going to sort of end the interview now, but thank you so much for participating and being a part of this interview and being a part of the project.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Sure. So I'll just stop recording now.